Hey, what's up, my two viewers? All right, I'm just going to do this in one take, so if there's mistakes in there, it is what it is. I want to talk about a book called The Truth by Neil Strauss. Now, I've never actually read the book, but I did watch a couple YouTube summaries about it and read a couple articles about it. And so here's just the takeaways that I got from it. So, first, a little bit of background. I read The 4 Hour Work Week back in, 2011 maybe. And after I read it, I kind of learned about this new lifestyle design and decided to leave West Point and take some time off to contemplate my life and where I wanted to go, what kind of direction I wanted my life to take. And I took my first, what Tim Ferriss would call a mini retirement in Brazil. And while I was there, maybe a little bit unsurprisingly, as a 20-year-old, I became interested in male female dynamics, relationship psychology, and sexual selection as a reflection of market social value. So basically, I read his initial book called The Game, which introduced me to the world of pickup artistry and its scientific approach to seduction. If you've never read The Game by Neil Strauss, I highly recommend it. It's a really interesting book. Basically, he was very unsuccessful with women throughout his early mid 20s up until then, and then this was back in probably 2000, the mid 2000s, and he got introduced to these pickup artists on these online forums who kind of try to break down seduction into a systematic approach and tested their ideas and theories and techniques and tactics and wrote about them on the online forums back in the good old days of the internet. And so he embedded himself into this community and learned their techniques, met the people, and wrote like a semi autobiography about it. And what he ultimately realized, and what I appreciate most from the game and the journey, is that real growth in a man's identity, character, and mindset is the only authentic way to achieve natural congruence and long term success in the mating game. So basically, in a free market, which the relationship market can be, there's different external factors that affect it, but in the modern world, it's pretty reflective of a market. And basically, the quality of the people that you are able to associate with is also a reflection of your quality. And that's true not just in relationships with males and females, but also just with your friends in general. And that's why people say that your network is your net worth, because typically the quality of individuals you associate with is also a reflection of your quality as a person. All right. So next, after writing The Game, Strauss would pen another book called The Truth, an uncomfortable book about relationships. And this is based on his personal journey regarding longer term romantic commitments. So The Game was kind of all about seduction, how to meet someone and get them into bed. But what he realized, what unsurprisingly, was that in order to maintain longer term, healthy, balanced, and reciprocal relationships with others, we must first discover the capacity to do so with ourselves. So, what happened with him was that finally he found a great girl, settled down, and that was kind of his goal of the game in the first place. But he found himself cheating on her and wondering what was wrong with himself. And this is what he realized, was that he had some untreated trauma from his past, and those will inevitably manifest externally in our interactions with others if we don't deal with them. So Strauss specifically targets trauma that arises from our childhoods because they're often disguised, but they're also more ingrained and pernicious than overt consequential events that we may experience as adults. So our parents are not perfect, because nobody is perfect. And so as children, there's times when our developmental needs are inevitably not met. And as a result, we develop some sort of childhood trauma. And the wounds of those, if untreated, will likely pass on to the next generation. And they can affect all areas of our life. And contrary to popular belief, most people aren't hateful perpetrators who act out this trauma in willful acts of evil. Most of us do so simply out of a lack of awareness. But nevertheless, unrecognized, unintentional, repeated childhood trauma can leave wounds just as deep as a single willful malicious act. So basically, what he was saying was that most of the times we don't know that we're acting out the trauma that is so ingrained in us, but doing so repeatedly over the course of our daily lives, while it's not one terrible act that we do, it still affects others, particularly our children or in our relationships in general. It can be just as devastating. So now here are some of the common characters and associated flaws that people develop as a result of these childhood traumas. So first, and this is one that I won't say a victim of, but one that I have a tendency to exhibit, is the revered hero. And revered heroes tend to be judgmental or perfectionist. And it can happen because your parents or your surroundings kind of put you on a pedestal and thought you were doing well and you were excelling as a kid. Then you have the troublemaking scapegoat, which is if your parents kind of blamed you for things that went wrong in the household. You have the neglected lost child if your parents kind of, or your caretakers had their own thing going on and kind of didn't pay any attention to you. You have the people-pleasing placater. If your parents, or if you had to kind of keep the peace and play the role of the caretaker in your family because your parents were either irresponsible or emotionally unavailable, and so you kind of had to keep the peace in the household, and so you had to play that role. And the mood-lifting mascot, I'm not quite sure what this part comes from, but it seems to me that it's kind of a combination of being a people pleaser and kind of having to lift the mood of your family members, and maybe being a scapegoat as well if you were blamed for certain things. So you felt responsible for all the things that were going wrong in your household. And some common character stories. So whenever we feel less than or better than others, it's apparent that we're stuck in these stories. So if you feel like if part of your internal dialogue is that you constantly feel like you're making bad decisions, it's probably because you had people who were constantly criticizing you or finding fault in you. If you feel like people wouldn't like you if they knew the real you, it might be because you had caretakers who constantly abandoned you and made you feel worthless. And if you feel like people aren't good enough for you, it's probably because you had others tell you that you were extraordinary or outstanding. All right, next we have the 3 developmental states. And so the wounded child typically will feel worthless, will feel needy, out of control, seeks attention, idealizes the world, and internalizes messages of caretakers. So I won't actually go through all of these, but basically there's 3 developmental states of your, I guess, emotional maturity. And whenever we get stuck in some of these older ones or these less developed ones, it's because there's situations that cause us to have these old wounds triggered. So ideally, we want to all be functional adults who have our self-esteem from within. We're able to effectively communicate our needs. We're flexible and moderate. We're in integrity in reality, and we integrate messages of caretakers. So one thing that's interesting is, let's see, as an adapted adolescent, you typically reject everything from when you were a child. You go 180 degrees to the other direction. So rather than feeling worthless, you feel like you know everything. Rather than being needy as a child, you're like, well, screw it, then I don't need anything or anyone. So you're needless. You try to control all aspects of your life because you're so interested in being self-sufficient and not needing your caretakers, because you're rejecting against that wounded child. You're disillusioned, obviously, about the world, hence the goth phase, because the wounded child idealized the world and now you're disillusioned about it. And you react against messages of caretakers. So everything that they say, you think is just BS because they wounded you. All right. And diagnosis and healing here. So I already talked about that. It's definitely not easy to see our own core issues. I know I have trouble with doing that. But one tip that Strauss recommends is to consider working backwards by linking present tendencies with past experiences. So that would be kind of taking a look at these developmental states of the wounded child and the adapted adolescent and seeing in what instances of life are you exhibiting those tendencies, and then link it to a past experience, as in, well, I'm very disillusioned about X, Y, and Z, and I can see that that was because this and this and this happened. Ultimately, it's not about blaming either yourself or others, but understanding and healing. And I think learning more about yourself and the developmental states and the common characters, you can see it both within yourself, but you can also see it in others and realize, like Strauss talks about, that um, you also become more understanding, I think. So you see when other people are behaving a certain way and realizing that sometimes they're just not aware, and it's not, you wouldn't blame them as much. You just realize they're not aware that they're doing certain things, and you just have a little bit more empathy and compassion for them. But also kind of realizing that it takes a lot of work to fix yourself, and it's definitely not easy, and because we have years of conditioning ingrained in us. And so, but if we don't do the work of fixing ourselves in a way, or transforming ourselves, then these tendencies will reflect in our interactions with others. So I hope you got something out of that. I will link the other video from, I think, Fight Mediocrity, which I really enjoyed, by Neil Strauss. And yeah, let me know what you think in this one take.